technical data that we were starting to get into at the end right there with Brian Snyder on how the actual materials and the chips and everything are actually behaving under stress. And has anyone ever wrestled with something called Javon's paradox? It has to do with the contrast of efficiencies and energy consumptions and the way that we used to think things would go in the electrical engineering world, and now everything is somehow magically different in this world of high global energy consumption. Well, our next speaker, of course, is someone that examines that and looks very closely and takes a better look at the efficiencies of the technology to help make a big improvements, and that directly relates to all of us here in the mining world. Our speaker is how does she know how to talk about this? Well, Dr. Elly is a PhD in nanotechnology from Rice University, and she's also the homeschool teacher of her very own children at home. And she is also the event organizer for another fellow conference. Many of you may be appearing at the Atlanta Bitcoin conference known as Tab 6 coming up next month. But here today, we're grateful to have the one and only Dr. Elly Pembroke.
What you don't know cannot. But you wanted it, but you don't know me, hands down.
Thank you, Scott, for asking me to speak today about nanotechnology. It's one of my favorite things to talk about. If we haven't met yet, my name is Elvira Pembroke. That's my full name, but I do go by Elly, and you'll find me as Elly Pembroke on social media and all that. I run a small company that's a Bitcoin education company called Pembroke Creative, but I have a background in nanotechnology, and that's what we're going to talk about today. So what is nanotechnology? Nanotechnology is the science of the very small things, typically things that are smaller than the visible wavelength of visible light. So smaller than about 200 nanometers, but bigger than an atom. So everything that has multiple atoms strung together. But since it's smaller than what we can see, we really have to find other ways than microscopes to make things and to measure things and to analyze things, and it's usually electrical. So for my PhD, I focused on graphene. And graphene is a single layer of carbon atoms. It's like graphite, but if you manage to peel off just one atomic layer of it, so it's really 1/10 of a nanometer thick, then it has really interesting electrical properties. And the electrical properties are that if you don't apply an electric field to it, it's going to not a negative electric field, then it will have really great electric properties and will conduct electricity really well. So what do we call something that conducts electricity sometimes and not other times? It's a semiconductor. So semiconductors are, of course, exciting and interesting because we can use them as switches that aren't mechanical, so they don't have mechanical stresses. And we use transistors to create the ones and the zeros, so the on and the off of an integrated circuit or a microchip. Okay, so that's what I did for, my PhD, but and I wish I could tell you that because graphene has these amazing semiconductor properties, my graphene field effect transistors are now in all the Bitcoin ASICs and iPhones and everything, but they're not, unfortunately. And why would that be? So after spending 5 years making graphene field effect transistors, I did learn a little something about why, the better you know something, the more you also know what its problem areas are. And to no one's surprise, a material that's so thin, it's just 1 atom thick, is really like a fuse that burns really easily. So there's a lot of engineering yet to do to be able to make a stable, reproducible repeatable design that can be built into all the microchips that we use. But it is a really cheap material because it's carbon-based, so it can be made from any organic waste or, I don't know, Girl Scout cookies, one thing my lab did. And it can be, the microchips that you could make out of graphene can be made at the fabs that are currently making metal oxide semiconductors or MOSFETs. So you wouldn't even need a very large startup cost to create these microchips. You can just run the same processes and just make the chips that are coming out smaller, better, faster, if you manage to do it. So what I did learn at the same time, though, as I was learning about the potential problem areas of using graphene as kind of the next step that could replace MOSFETs, is that Bitcoin was invented at the same time or around the same time. And honestly, the more I learn about Bitcoin, the more I can tell that Bitcoin is the future. So this is why we're here. We're trying to, we believe that Bitcoin is here to stay. And what we're just trying to do is make Bitcoin mining better, faster, more efficient. So, but Bitcoin mining, the protocol itself is just math. It's really a computation that can be done with pencil and paper. If you haven't already, look up YouTube, SHA-256 with pencil and paper. You'll find a video where someone calculates through the whole thing. You could really run the math yourself. The only reason we're not doing it with pencil and paper is microchips are better at it. They're faster. So, yeah. Anyone with a computer would outperform anyone who's doing it with pencil and paper. But so in the beginning, it was actually mined with CPUs or central processing units. Satoshi Nakamoto, Hal Finney, a lot of others mined with CPUs. And I want to read you something that Satoshi wrote on the Bitcoin forum in December 12, 2009. We could have a gentleman's agreement to postpone the GPU arms race as long as we can for the good of the network. It's much easier to get new users up to speed if they don't have to worry about GPU drivers and compatibility. It's nice how anyone with just a CPU can compete fairly equally right now. So that's what Satoshi had to say. Do we have any gentlemen in this room who are still mining with CPUs? No? Where did all the gentlemen go? No gentleman's agreement here. Very clearly, the people who mined with GPUs ended up winning that argument. But why GPUs? Why graphics processing units? Why would a graphics processor be better at mining Bitcoin, at just doing a mathematical operation that is the hash or the SHA-256 algorithm than a CPU? Well, that's because in a graphics processing unit, you're also doing just one mathematical operation, but you do it in parallel, so you can do a lot more operations at the same time. So you can, if you have compatibility and the right drivers, you can just have those parallel processes be hash functions instead and mine Bitcoin. So that's where the first innovation came from. And it didn't take long. Were people who knew a little bit something about logic gates and how how GPUs work and how their logic layout leads to them being able to do parallel processes, to simplify the logic layout even further, to not do the matrix operations that GPUs do, but just do the hash functions that now Bitcoin mining ASICs do. And ASICs, the reason we've had that explosion of efficiency gains was really just the innovation that we've seen with people optimizing the logic layout of the transistors. The transistors themselves, the ones and zeros, are the same in CPUs in our phones as they are in GPUs or ASICs. Like Brian said, that there hasn't been a lot of innovation. The innovation that we've seen in Bitcoin ASICs, or the transistors getting smaller, was mostly driven by the incentives and constraints that we have for making CPUs better, smaller, faster. They have not been driven by Bitcoin incentives. But that needs to change. We need to set up a different optimization problem. We have some engineers in the room. So we are actually trying to optimize and solve for different problems with Bitcoin ASICs than we do in CPUs. We don't need them to be small. We don't need to decrease the size of the individual transistor further. We don't need the boxes to be small. We don't mind if our box contains very large units, as long as they are more power efficient. So here we are with a new set of problems. And that's really the takeaway that I hope that you will get from this talk, is that that we can, sorry, let me find this here. That Bitcoin mining optimizes for different problems compared to consumer electronics. And what we're optimizing for is not the size of the field effect transistor, or even another thing that came up is we're not even trying to accurately compute everything. So CPUs and even GPUs today, or applications for AI, need all the computations that are done to be accurate so that we don't see glitches in our Netflix movies. For Bitcoin mining, since most of the hashes that we compute are thrown out anyways, if every thousandth of them is wrong or faulty, it doesn't really matter. The only thing that we care about is the winning hashes, and we can just recompute the winning hash to make sure that it's not faulty. And that will take a lot less time than, we end up being able to use technologies that maybe are a little more error prone, but they might be cheaper, or they might be smaller. Like the smaller your transistor is, the more leakage current you might have through it, the more prone to error it might be. But what if you don't really care about the errors that much? Well, there's an avenue of innovation right there. And the cool thing, too, is that we can move on to not just making transistors made out of the same materials, metal oxide, field effect transistors, MOSFETs, smaller and smaller, like the rest of the industry does. We can really innovate and try to make something new. We can break out of that local maximum and really go and search for what other avenues do we have. So that's where I really want to see innovation going. At the transistor level, we can experiment with different channel sizes, with different materials, not just graphene or metal oxides. We can start using maybe biological systems, like proteins or DNA for switching. We can use optical computing and try to see if we can find a more efficient way to switch from ones to zeros. We can maybe walk away from digital computing all the way and not use ones and zeros and just use analog computing. That's kind of where computing started, but why not try out, since it's a very simple computation and it's just done over and over, maybe an analog system would actually be a more power efficient way to compute hashes. We can also experiment with the logic. So the logic, like I said, has improved, has made Bitcoin mining very specialized. So you can't really run a Netflix movie or AI on a Bitcoin mining ASIC. But what if we made the logic compatible with AI, and it would consume maybe a little more electricity, but it would be versatile? So it could be a chip that can do both, and then you can just switch your data center to whatever you require at the time. I can imagine that that would be experimented with in the future. We could, the different materials that we use could lower our production cost enormously, like using carbon instead of silicon in our chips. We could, like Brian was talking about, cooling, being able to optimize cooling from the ground up rather than just taking the fans off and throwing them away, and immersing, like using machines for immersion cooling that weren't built for immersion cooling. Like those kinds of problem solving techniques are great when you have a wide margin and you're just trying to solve the problem of the day. But if we're trying to be competitive, we need to start engineering from the ground up and try to create machines that are actually built for immersion cooling, or for overclocking, or machines that are meant to operate at higher temperatures instead of just cooling them down to the operating temperature of a CPU, because they were built initially for CPU technology. But now with a different set of constraints, with a different problem that we're trying to solve, we can actually move into innovation and then use the lessons we learn from building more efficient Bitcoin ASICs to then go and improve CPUs and commercial electronics as well. Thank you. Yes, Peter.
Proteins and transistors. This is something that I've read about in a couple of scientific magazines, and where my brain goes first is, like, we are this amazing energized battery, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm curious as to what pragmatic or practical applications you have seen so far using, biological and proteins and transistors to essentially adapt and be able to change and be able to switch on and off things. So I'm not an expert in that area. I'm just curious what you've seen.
Yeah, I know. It's fascinating stuff. None of it is practical.
Oh, well, I have to imagine that they have these they have these watches, right, that tell you how many steps you have, right?
So it's all very experimental, and so biomolecules are actually at bigger than nanoscale. So they're actually quite large, and they require a lot of energy, which is why we eat so much. But they are very efficient. So in the case of DNA, for example, they have 4 base pairs, right? So this is not a binary one on-off system. This is a 4-state system. So this is more like a quantum computer. So the more states you have, the more complicated computations you can do with fewer switches. Yeah, all of that is like lab level stuff. None of it is anywhere near true
I
application.
was just hoping that you were going to tell us that there's going to be a day when I have this little wrist thing that I'm walking and I'm powering and mining Bitcoin while I'm walking. That is the goal.
Yeah, that would be cool. So what already exists though is a friend of mine built a bicycle where you work out and it runs a Bitcoin miner.
Are you familiar with any adiabatic logic techniques being applied in this area?
So adiabatic meaning temperature.
Adiabatic logic, reversible computing.
Oh, reversible computing.
Yeah.
Sure, but so the point of hash functions though is to be an irreversible function, right? Like, so you can. So yeah, no, I'm not super familiar.
Okay.
Sorry.
Okay, it's basically applying sinusoidal signals instead of VDD. So you're capturing the energy, throwing it back into the circuit with inductors.
Okay.
Energy recovery techniques.
Okay, so you're just so instead of just expending the energy that you're using to switch from off to on,
You don't send it to ground.
You
send it to the inductor, you reuse it. Exactly.
Yeah, you can do that. That sounds like a great idea, especially for energy recapture.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, talking about graphene, DARPA's been that's been a technology for a long time with a lot of promise. Do you see anyone commercializing or making it practical right now?
So there have been some attempts to make displays for it. And despite people being very, very excited about it, so the Nobel Prize in Physics was awarded to graphene in 2010. And at the time, people really thought that that was going to succeed MOSFETs within like 5 years. And it just hasn't happened. And from my personal experience in the lab working with it, it's because the material itself is very difficult to work with. And yeah, it's very finicky. It's like a sheet of paper, but only one atom thick. It burns really easily. So that's not to say that it's impossible. It's just very, very difficult. But then even transistors, if anyone has seen a picture of the original transistor and what transistors look like now compared to that, is night and day. So what engineers can take and create out of it, there is a lot of hope, that it really can become something great, but it's currently in no devices at all.
So you outline like a lot of different like future possibilities for like Bitcoin mining ASICs, and just like from making them smaller or making them bigger, and also like making them more compatible with immersion technologies. So just like overall, like where do you see like innovation going for new Bitcoin mining ASICs, like more immediately in the future?
Yeah, so you're right in that we need to have both a short-term and a long-term perspective. For long-term perspective, we definitely need that true innovation of moving beyond the things that were developed for CPUs. But in the short term, and I think in terms of Bitcoin ASICs, we're still in the short term. We are still using immersion cooling for devices that have the power plug on the wrong side. Like there's still a lot of common sense efficiency improvements that are just convenience, and where a lot of efficiency is going to come from that doesn't require rocket science. And I think it's going to continue that route for another 10 years or so. And then, but the only way we can have efficiency improvements in 10 years is if we start developing them now. So what we're developing now needs to be for the future, while we still have that runway of immediate non-rocket science, engineering, tinker improvements can be made. All right. Well, if there's no other questions, I guess we'll take another break. Thank you.